So at this point, I'm excited to introduce Damon Hall, who's our speaker this morning. I was sharing before we were started the session that I had first met Damon at the Urban Pollinators meeting in Traverse City, Michigan. He's got some really interesting work that crosses a lot of different barriers, social policy, economic, cultural barriers, looking at what can affect pollinator conservation. He's an assistant professor at the University of Missouri, where he has a joint appointment in the School of Natural Resources and the Department of Biomedical, Biological, and Chemical Engineering. He coordinates programs related to sustainability and also water resources. And his research examines, I'm going to read this so I get it right, interactions between social and ecological systems where science, policy, and culture meet. And interestingly, he also has a honeybee background from his undergraduate work at Purdue. So Damon, thanks so much for joining us this morning. I'm really excited to cap off this session learning about your work there at Missouri.
Great, thank you so much. I'm really happy to be here and excited to share this work with you all. And we're good, you can see slides?
All looks good.
All right. I want to start this talk by sharing a research paper that a colleague and I published last year. And I think that its topic relates to and speaks to the trends of how people are feeling about insect pollinator conservation and policy. So the paper is The Human Dimensions of Insect Pollinator Conservation. And I think that the research can be summed up with one meme. Save you the time and read this meme. It's this: I remember when I used to see a bee and go, ah, a bee. And now I'm all, oh, wow, a bee. Hi, you okay there? Need anything? Can I get you a drink, a cushion? Want to borrow the car? As a society and a culture, just within the past decade, it seems we now like bees. This is a fact that is driven by, we like the variety of food that we have. We appreciate the variety, and we're learning that about 1 in 3 bites of every food that we eat was pollinated by a bee. Or perhaps, maybe the implications on coffee are terrified if we lost insect pollinators for the 86% of us addicted to coffee. We know that our food choices would be decimated without insect pollinators. And then some of the other implications of loss of insect pollinators are the need to pollinate by hand. So here is hand pollination of oranges in China. And if you think your produce is expensive now, we have seen increases in prices of pollinator-dependent crops. Almonds are a good example, which need the horn-faced bee, although they do use managed honeybees. Prices have increased. And it's not just fruits, nuts, and vegetables. This is an alfalfa field, and alfalfa pricing, which is fed to dairy cows and to beef cows. And so this could affect our price of ice cream. Oh boy. We know that it's not simply a matter of throwing more managed honeybees at these crops. Dr. Camilo's talk on Tuesday noted the importance of native bees on all crops, and for how many crops a single bumblebee or an orchard bee or a mason bee or another native bee can be as effective as 60 to even 80 honeybees. So the threat of losing native bees looms ominously because of these price signals and price increases in foods that can destabilize economies, and then, as we know, can have impact on national security and national economies. So this is a major concern of governments and lawmakers. This concern about supply chain and food prices and the uncertainty with impacts of insect pollinators on which we're all dependent has led scientists to gather and synthesize research to make policy recommendations to lawmakers around the world. This 2016 Intergovernmental Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services report showed that pollination services, in terms of global annual value, is about $500 billion each year. And further and more alarming is that about 40% of invertebrate pollinator species, particularly bees and butterflies, face extinction. It is in this context and the spirit of a precautionary principle that there is enough information to act. But what are lawmakers doing? And this is what I want to take us on a tour through today across different scales of governance But first, let me begin where I started and how I got into all of this. In the late 1990s, I was a college student. I took a course on beekeeping from Tom Turpin at Purdue. And Greg Hunt, the geneticist, honeybee geneticist, had a job opening for a full-time beekeeper. I needed the money, and I was very interested in bees, so I applied. My very first day on the job, I was called to a rail yard in town where about 12 grown men railroad workers stood terrified about 100 feet away, pointing up to a grain elevator where a swarm of honeybees had landed and took temporary residence. And it had completely shut down work at the rail yard of loading the grain. So I went up on top of a hopper car and cleaned them out so work could resume. This was kind of the late 1990s, the yikes a bee way of thinking. 2 years later, I was extracting semen from drone bees, artificially inseminating queens. I managed 115 hives, including 15 Africanized beehives for a PhD student studying aggressive behavior and genetics with the famed QTL allele. But it was the second spring on the job in 2001 that really transformed my experience in beekeeping and interest in insect pollinators. It was the spring, and I went to reopen the hives, and one after the other, we were finding the hives were dead or severely dwindled. We lost about 75% of these 115 hives, and that was really the first time that we were seeing this colony collapse disorder. And my boss, who's a brilliant bee expert and geneticist who's been on the Discovery Channel for his work on, he was baffled, just like we all were. I went on to grad school to study social sciences and policy, but I always followed the bee news. And it was in 2006, roughly thereabouts, that colony collapse disorder was coined as a name under the preliminary report. But even before the coining of this name, there were observations of colony collapse in the 90s. But by 2013, The World Without Bees was a cover story on Time magazine. And it was not just the European honeybee that we were seeing these declines. Declines were also observed in native bee populations. You've heard this week that there are many stressors on bees, and this is really where we see the policy implications. All environmental policies regulate one thing: human behavior. And so how human behavior interacts and drives these stressors on bees is important, and really the targets for policy. So the biggest concern is the loss of habitat in terms of the way that we have become so efficient in agriculture. We can farm now right up to the fence row, and how agriculture has changed since many generations grew up on the 19-teens and 20s on a farm that had back 40 acres for grazing and plenty of floral resources. That's changed now. Many folks have moved to the city, and there are simply fewer flowers. There are also new chemicals introduced into the system of fungicides as well as neonicotinoids, and that tends to weaken the immune system of bees, which makes them more susceptible to pests and parasites. These stressors have contributed to severe declines in native bees, and we see them in bumblebees. But in reality, the bee conservation policy story is lagging behind a lot of the science. One area, unfortunately, that the science is catching up is where we don't want it to, which is where the policy is catching up to the science, is where we don't want it to, which is in endangered species, in the Endangered Species Act. So in 2017, the rusty patch bumblebee was listed, and trends are clear for many of our bumblebees that are following similar trajectories. And it's a big deal to list an endangered species, have a species listed as an endangered. It takes a lot of research, a lot of meetings, a lot of funding priorities have to be shifted, especially in the context that right now there are a backlog of species needing full investigation about whether to list them or not. So for the rusty patch to make this list is very concerning. We do know more monitoring is needed, but the risk to biodiversity and food security are terrifying. And the pattern is seen elsewhere. Recently, a federal review of existing data unveiled this alarming trend of Western bumblebee populations, which have seen its numbers decline by 93% just in the past 2 decades. With butterflies, there was a study on 450 species of Western butterflies, and what was found is that the total species have shrunk by 1.6% each year for the last 4 decades. Much of this has been related to warmer weather in the fall, stressing plants that butterflies rely on for food and habitat. As much of the American West is getting drier, such are the impacts of climate change or a changing climate. We're seeing the same story with different data sets of these declines around the world using international networks, 3 centuries worth of records from museums, universities, private collections. Approximately 25% of species were found, fewer species were found between 2006 and 2015 than before 1990. These papers came out earlier this year. Clearly, something is happening to our pollinating insects. The past 2 years, scientists have been looking at patterns of decline in relation to changing weather patterns and changing climate. This is a figure of bumblebee species richness. The climate-related factors such as temperature, precipitation, may have a bigger effect on wild bee abundance than other landscape variables. So the white and the light yellow areas are normal. Anything in that darker orange or orange is bad. This is happening for most all species of insects, but the implications and declines for insect pollinators, especially bees, are easiest for us to imagine. So what are societies doing, human societies doing? What are the implications? What do we know? A meta-study, so a study of studies, show that the consistent driver of pollinator health, insect pollinator health, is flowers. It's the presence and diversity and the timing of the availability of forage for bees. And so this is an area of consensus. We know scientifically, this is what we know. So we also know, though, that a consensus of science does not automatically lead to good policy. Policy instead has to take its cues from not science, but society and cultural norms. I like this quote from Clark and Keller. Natural resource policy and environmental management is a social practice, often lacking scientific grounds, that is driven by external forces and divergent perspectives of the problems and the solutions. Another quote that I like from former chief of the U.S. Forest Service about managing natural resources is from Jack Ward Thomas, who says, managing natural resources is 5% managing nature and 95% managing people. Environmental policy, conservation policy must manage people. It's the human behaviors and values and land uses that have to be the targets of policy. So I began looking at insect pollinator policy. And clearly there's a problem, right? We know this in June of 2014, President Obama's coordinated the Pollinator Health Task Force to address what was labeled as an insect pollinator health crisis. And so Tom Vilsack and Gina McCarthy were chairs of that. So they're both in the Biden administration now. They coordinated 15 federal agencies that had something to do with federal lands or anything to do with federal lands and drafted an action plan in 2016. What I wanted to know in this study was what is being done in the realm of federal policy and state policy, and then are these policies created the types of policy that address a crisis? So at first I looked at the federal government and looked at the legislature between what they had passed between 2000 and 2017. And I found 31 insect pollinator bills were brought to Congress, but Congress only passed 4 of them. There were no standout laws among these. There was one that declared a National Pollinator Week, another focused on beekeeping, but nothing that was befitting of a crisis of insect pollinator health. So I didn't find any sweeping international treaties either. And because laws are mutually agreed upon limits to human behaviors based on shared goals and values, it really seemed like international and national policy suffers from a lack of agreement on substance rather than public desire. So this is important to the public, but what exactly are we going to do? Couldn't find that. In the absence of sweeping and comprehensive national legislation, what we began to look at were US state legislatures and seeing what they were doing to address insect pollinator declines. So first, US states are responsible for managing the livestock and wild animals within their state. The management of wildlife is held in trust for the use of citizens. And so for honeybees or managed bees, some alfalfa leafcutter bees, orchard bees, some bumblebees, they are considered livestock, and thus they are managed by the laws and policies and regulations of a state Department of Agriculture. So this is for honeybees, a lot of registering and for disease and monitoring of disease. For wild bees and for native bees, because they are considered wildlife. So butterflies and bees are considered wildlife. They are the responsibility of state wildlife agencies. What we wanted to know was what state policies are being addressed to and passed that are relevant to insect pollinators, and of those passed, what are the policy areas of agreement? So we're only looking at bills that were actually passed and signed into law, and not just looking at the number of bills that come out. And we were really focused on these areas of consensus, thinking that federal or international policy have to start with these points of consensus, and that's where these policies will originate. So we looked at all 50 US state legislatures for laws passed related to insect pollinators between 2000 and 2017. US states were selected because legislators most closely resemble the American people. There's 77,383 legislators, and they know their constituents and their region's agricultural crops, how much people value their home state's biodiversity. But also the history of environmental policy shows that the best policy innovations occur at the state levels and then are piloted at that level, and then eventually maybe, the good ideas may be scaled up. We selected this time frame because the time frame captures pre-colony collapse disorder, which was, as I said, described around 2006. It also captures some widely publicized visible events like the Wilsonville, Oregon bee kills of 2013, where some trees were sprayed in a Target parking lot, and then there were a number of dead native bees and bumblebees all over people's cars. This also covers the White House Pollinator Health Task Force, IPBES report, among others. Again, we only looked at bills that were passed because they represent the majority agreement among legislators, and they cross those traditional divides, the right-left, the urban-rural, the religious-secular, the rich-poor, etc. We found 109 laws that increased in frequency following 2013. We counted all these laws, so this is our top table here. We noted that 14 states had passed none during this period of time. 5 states had passed more than 7. But of course, the number of policies passed does not reflect the strength of the policy. For example, Connecticut and Vermont passed 1 to 2 policies that were actually quite comprehensive. We only looked at bills that passed the legislatures and were signed into law, so that doesn't include any executive actions from the governors or any programs initiated by the executive branches. So these actions were all initiated by the state legislators. And of course, it does reflect agreement with the governor because the governors signed all of these as well. So there are levels of agreement. We also cataloged all the policies and categorized them according to theme. We identified from our reading there were about 1,100 pages of law that we sorted through and read. This lower table was very important to me that we had this kind of ugly, big, it's a 2.5-page table that spans in this article, but it shows all of the 109 policies in one place. And these are difficult to find. We had to do a lot of work to find these. Every website that is of the state legislature, every state's websites are different. And so the searching took months. And so we wanted to put them all in one place so lawmakers or other researchers could use it. So Table 1 is a resource for lawmakers, researchers, environmental NGOs, citizens, legislative staff members to learn what are the areas of agreement, and then simply what legal language may work in your state. So in terms of the protocol for gathering these, we use stem searches and Boolean searches in USA.gov. We also then went to each state's websites to look from Alabama to Wyoming, to look through the legislative websites of what was passed. And then to make sure that we had everything, we emailed each state's legislative librarian requesting pieces of legislation, date passed that pertain to pollinators. We gave them some ideas of what it could include. 42 states responded, and then we resent the inquiry to the other states, and then these folks here on the last row never replied to us at all. This is a lot of what we were reading. Law. What we found were states wrote and passed laws to address insect pollinator declines around 3 thematic areas. And so states are innovating new policies around insect pollinators, around wildlife and livestock. So you can see apiculture. What we saw in that category is registering hives, disposal equipment, really disease management, inspections, pesticides in terms of improving training and licensing and moratoriums on certain neonicotinoid uses, primarily among state agencies or state-funded landscapes. We saw themes around research, the conservation of, the enhancement of, the development of, and direct funding for certain research projects and research labs around the country. We also saw policies organized around awareness, pollinator awareness weeks, and acknowledging different needs of knowledge. Some of the trends we saw that indeed states are innovating laws for pollinators, both categorically as wildlife and livestock, that there is evidence of insects no longer being indiscriminately lumped together as pests. So there were a number of policies that were revising language of past laws to show that insects are beneficial to humankind. These policies represent the legal areas of majority consensus and bipartisan agreement. And so that's interesting to see. And that other states, nations can use these to write and update their own policies. So this evidence is what's possible, what has been passed elsewhere. We then took these 109 laws and compared them to what the international community of scientists of the IPBES were writing about, and they developed these 10 pollinator policy targets. This is Dix et al. 2016 in Science. You can see here a number of these are developing incentives to help farmers benefit from ecosystem services, integrating the IPM, integrated pest management, developing long-term monitoring of pollinators and pollination. So this is what the international community of scientists said. These are the 10 targets. We wondered how our US 109 policy stacked up with what the international community was calling for from these lawmakers. And we found that US states were not addressing about 5 of these areas of what experts say are most important. So you see here are zeros and even these areas here. I think what is most alarming is the lack of policy action related to monitoring. Monitoring of native bees and insect pollinating populations are critical if we're going to learn what actions work and if what we're doing is making a difference. We need to monitor. Also, we need to monitor in case there are new stressors on bee populations that we can then begin to quickly identify and address as they may enter the environment. So like water quality monitoring, I think we need bee quality monitoring. Based on these comparisons, In sum, we conclude that despite a rise in policy action at state levels, policies are early and rather anemic steps for addressing a crisis. Most promising is the work of a few states, Connecticut, Vermont, California, Minnesota, that have established funding mechanisms and appropriations for habitat enhancements and research. They also established task force to coordinate various experts to address this problem in their state's agricultural and geographic and social settings. And there are a number of new policies and new bills that are introduced regularly every year. I don't read the bills too much. I like to try to wait until they move into law. They do represent a trend, but you never know how much hold they have as they are being introduced, and then what happens to them over the life of the policy. All right, so we've looked at the legislative branch. Let's take a look at the executive branch activities. Executive branches would be, in the federal side, would be the White House, of course, but for governor's office at the state levels, they are the ones who manage or have oversight over the state wildlife agencies and state agricultural agencies. A lot of budgetary activities and priorities are dictated by that governor's office. We know that humans are not the only ones affected by this crisis. Over 2/3 of all plants used for forage by wildlife require bee pollination. And so this is why a number of state wildlife agencies and natural resource agencies and organizations are developing pollinator conservation programming. I suggest perhaps adding this: 2 out of 3 bites of food that wildlife eat is pollinated by a bee. What we see is increasing in these executive branches and actions and priorities are federal and state agencies working together. Sometimes that's dictated within states. And so here's Illinois, possessive that is, state agencies have joined a pact to protect monarch butterfly habitat. And so in Illinois, there are state agency coordination. So 4 state agencies have signed this pact to protect monarch butterflies. Another coordinating effort among federal and state wildlife agencies is represented by the state wildlife action plans, which are decadal planning tools for identifying wildlife conservation priorities and comprehensive conservation planning. So in 2002, Congress created the State Wildlife Grant Program, and to receive federal funding from this non-game wildlife management program, states have to develop these comprehensive state wildlife action plans, or SWAPs. So what we did in our lab was we took a look at the 2015 SWAPs. We gathered 55, so from the states and territories, and began analyzing them. We have 3 projects right now within this space. We really wanted to know at first, how are these state wildlife action plans targeting insect pollinators and bees in particular? And you can see from this kind of preliminary table here that 19 states and territories did not mention bees at all in their state wildlife action plans. And 8 others did not mention insect pollinators. So this is a document from 2015 that's supposed to cover 2025. We're examining these to identify similar trends of what states are most active in these spaces. We have another student working on targeting just monarch butterfly activity and actions and how they appear in these documents. Undergraduate student researcher has been working on the historic range of the rusty patch bumblebee and looking at the 2005 as well as the 2015 state wildlife action plans, examining what states were doing about this. So this is still ongoing. I want to move to talk about urban areas, and this is some of what you heard this week, that a surprising body of findings are coming out from urban ecology research, that cities have diverse and abundant populations of bees. And we're seeing it through California, New York City and Phoenix, all over Canada and Australia, Berlin, throughout cities in the UK, and London. Species of native bees are able to live and even thrive in urban environments. This is counterintuitive, right? It's that we've seen cities as these biological deserts, as we heard this week. And what is most shocking is that in several cases, more diverse and abundant populations of bees live in cities than in nearby rural areas. So this flips a lot of things that we thought we knew on its head about urban areas. And it causes us to rethink some assumptions. Indeed, it does raise questions about trends in agricultural use, but in the homogenization of agricultural lands, but this also calls for seeing urban lands anew. Particularly in an urbanizing world, where by 2050, the United Nations estimates 60% of the Earth's people will live in cities. What is it about urban land uses that enable bees to survive? Because cities are human-dominated landscapes, an example of what Tansley called the anthropogenic ecosystems, for me, I see this as a social and cultural question. What is it about how we are doing cities, developing cities, that enable bees to survive? It's something about our diverse people, our diverse preferences for different kinds of flowers that have an impact. And this has implications for urban planning, urban design, and policy across several scales. In light of these findings, how should state and federal natural resource management agencies change urban conservation programming? This is in part what we wrote about in 2017 in Conservation Biology, asking what are natural resource management agencies going to do in light of these findings. In the 1980s and 1990s, natural resource management wildlife agencies developed outreach programs for urban wildlife conservation. This was spurred largely in part by declines in hunting and fishing licenses, but they also wanted to gain new visitors, but also better connect with urban populations and urban voters who vote on budgets. Agencies took rural activities for the most part and then moved them to the cities. So taking inner city kids fishing, for example. The programming looked and has looked more like ambassadorial work, design, rather than any type of activity that's designed to achieve a meaningful conservation objective. Native bee conservation is achievable, and it can be a meaningful conservation objective, especially because the habitat needs of most native bees are small. If they have forage, native bees can spend much of their lives in a small urban front yard. So these habitat needs are small compared to other mammals. So it's not like we're bringing ocelots back to Texas or changing habitat to accept Florida panthers. The scale of these conservation activities means that homeowners, businesses, municipalities can provide this habitat that in aggregate improve insect pollinator populations. So in response to this, urban habitat and the fact that urban habitat is valuable to bees and insect pollinator health, there are many things that cities are starting to do. One is increasing the number of taxpayer-funded municipal policy efforts. And so here is improvement of insect pollinator habitat. Germany is going to spend €1.5 million to install bee gardens across about 100 bee gardens across several cities. New York City just established a week ahead of Pollinator Week, the Pollinator Places. They have 8 so far. This is dovetailing with the 2013 law that requires public parks to plant native plants to conserve native life. Amsterdam has a series of funded bee hotels, bee stops, and a honey highway, where taxpayer dollars are used to build these facilities and plant flowers. I think also interesting is the green roof bus stops. In the Netherlands, a number of cities are doing it, but Utrecht has replaced the roofs of about 316 public bus stops. It planted forbs on top to improve habitat. Leicester in the UK has about 30 of these. Cardiff has some in Wales. Dublin, there are 14 that just were put in San Francisco, Philadelphia, Buffalo, New York. And the idea is providing habitat for bees in these spaces. What's interesting that I've just seen out of Singapore is this is beginning to be extended to buses. So we're seeing green roofs on buses as a way to reduce emissions and improve air quality. These are also being piloted in Spain and other locations. And if you're a bee, this is pretty helpful. It's kind of like having the ice cream truck visit your neighborhood, right? You're on your bus stop eating, and then a bus comes and you eat a little bit there and you come back. Gerardo talked about how lazy bees are, but this is next level laziness if we have both of these. Several municipalities are also considering the value of turf grass lawns and ways that they can encourage homeowners to provide habitat of diverse species of flowers for bees. I really like this quote from systems theorist Gregory Bateson. The major problems of the world are the result of the difference between how nature works and the way people think. Homeowners are beginning to rethink their lawns from the bees' perspective. Science is catching up. It is becoming more known of our dependence, our biological dependence upon insect pollinators. And so homeowners are one place to begin researching as well, both for policy, but also just social and behavioral norms. Residential yards account for about 25 to 60% of the total green space in US cities. These are often overlooked. Individual homeowners are important land managers, and we should see them as such. And so projects that we're working on in collaboration with Gerardo that we're interested in seeing urban residents as land managers. And because, again, most of these bees can live their entire lives with multiple generations in small spaces, provided they have nesting and floral habitat. Persons who manage these yards, either small yards, lawns, properties, even balconies, we're seeing in Brazil, homeowners or renters can have an impact on bees. Of secondary interest are the conversations that are occurring around yards, lawns, gardens, and bees. Because the American lawn and gardens are such a significant cultural construction, this is something that we've been looking at as well. And this paper came out last week, the Burr et al., about wildness and how homeowners are using the language of wild to talk about ecological functioning and distinguishing and setting up a new aesthetic. We know that weedy species in grass mixes feed bees, and they have a lot of value, and the timing matters, and we'll see that in a bit. I think one of the best studies on this is the work of Susanna Lehrman, and showing how lawns have valuable forage. She set up a study in Massachusetts where they had 3 groups of homeowners that mowed their lawn at different timings. So once mowed once every week, and then they'd come out and sample the bees. And then another set of homeowners would mow once every 2 weeks and sample the bees. And then the other once every 3 weeks. So for those that mowed once every 2 weeks, the increase in the number of bee species was about 60% increase as compared to those who mowed just once a week. So this is just from the little flowers and the small bees that are using it that often remain invisible. For those who mowed once every 3 weeks, there was a 300% increase in the number of bee species using that space. There is tremendous value in our lawns, and we need to begin to rethink our habits based on what's happening in the natural world. One such example in the policy realm is from Minnesota in their Lawns to Legumes program. I think this is perhaps the most innovative in that law as aligned with the biological reality in this policy. What they do is they have set aside money to pay homeowners to replace their lawns with native plants and meadows for bees. For people that are within the Rusty Patch Bumblebee area, and zones, they're eligible for up to $500, other about $350. And what's neat is this emerged from a governor-initiated statewide insect pollinator task force with university, industry, and government representatives. And this is something that came out of those regular meetings of scientists and lawmakers. Yeah, it's very simple, and it's an elegant program. It's also popular. In the first year of the program, 7,500 people applied in 84 of Minnesota's 87 counties for about 1,000 awards. So there is a desire that is outpacing the funding for this program. And we can contrast this with many of the outdated, oh, here's a transformation here, or outmoded city ordinances and noxious weeds and nuisance properties. So I'll share two examples of those, of nuisance ordinances, and this is an area that absolutely needs rethinking and reconsideration, and cities are doing that. Two from the St. Louis area. This is in Maplewood, Missouri. The headline was, "A Maplewood woman may be sent to jail over a dispute over the definition of a weed." So since 2012, Alice Hazel has received at least 5 citations from the city because of her flowers. For several years, she decided to plant milkweed because natural habitat for the monarch, but also the mayor of St. Louis had called for citizens to plant milkweed in this Milkweeds for Monarchs Mayor's Pledge. They said that she violated the policy that owners, lessees, renters shall not allow or maintain any growth of grass or weeds to a height of over 12 inches. We have a long way to go in rewriting these outmoded and pathological policies for species that we depend upon. Another example, in St. Peters, Missouri, St. Peters couple battle over turf requirement leads to federal court. Janice Duffner is allergic to grass. She says it triggers her asthma. And she found that when she took out the grass of her life, she could sleep through the night and didn't need an inhaler. But in 2014, the couple received a letter saying that they had violated a 2008 city ordinance requiring at least that all homeowners had to have at least 50% of their lot covered in turf grass. Suit says that under the ordinance penalties, the Duffners could face fines anywhere from $7,500 to $188,000 or more than or up to 20 years in jail. So after 2 years of legal battles in state court that led to a civil rights case, the lawsuit to the federal judge that was sent to St. Peters, the court ruled with the city, essentially, that the aesthetic considerations constitute a legitimate government purpose. So again, a long way to go, and I'm not sure the settlement and the amount of money that was paid for this, but we've got a long way to go. You've heard this week that there are a few things you can do to deal with these anachronistic laws that are still on the books. Put up a sign, or you can mow an edge on it to show that it's managed, this is intentional, but more is needed. In Chicago, they recently passed a city ordinance of documenting the exemptions and the exceptions to these outdated nuisance lawn policies. So homeowners can register their lawns with the city to avoid being fined. So it's the Chicago Lawn Registry of the Municipal Code of Chicago. That's something that could be replicated in other cities as well. For those who may be wrestling with homeowner associations, Maryland General Assembly passed a policy that was effective this October that homeowners associations could not prevent the planting of native plants on lawns, including those designed to support and attract pollinators. So this is something that was important to the folks in Maryland. This is something that also could be replicated elsewhere. One program developed by the Xerxes Society is the Bee City USA program of No Mow May. And this works with cities to temporarily suspend nuisance ordinances to promote habitat. And what's interesting is that the policy lines up with the science in focusing on where it's needed most, which is early spring. So these are education programs, incentivizing insect-friendly lawns, and changing mowing behaviors. Started in the UK, spread to Canada. Much of this is in Wisconsin and Iowa. And as cities relax these codes to promote habitat. This fits well with what we know about the forage and habitat needs of insect pollinators. This is one study of the food bottlenecks of March and September of resource bottlenecks. And this study showed that nectar supply during September is a strong predictor of the buff-tailed bumblebee colony density the following year. So having enough to eat in late fall determines the robustness of that colony the next year. And it explained over half of all the variation in colony density. No other period of resource availability showed a significant association. So there are management implications of this, and it's similar for early spring as well. The first flowers that come up, those bumblebee queens need those to establish their colony for that year. And so homeowners can manage to increase these early spring and late summer nectar plantings. Changing a mowing regime or just not mowing, not killing those first season dandelions, supporting late season flowering wild plants like red clover and solidago. This is critical as a detail for global declines too. We know that we have a lack of habitat problem. Why don't we agree on having more rules to incentivize enhancing habitat? And I like to think of this as kind of the bachelor's refrigerator in September for bees, which is pretty bleak. These species do well late season in North America. All right, I've taken you through a policy tour through insect pollinator policy, through legislative, executive, and judicial branches of government. What we see in some are that activities are rather encouraging across all areas, with the exception of the courts. Go figure this week. The courts are simply reflecting the written law. Many of our laws at municipal, state level are outmoded and outdated and do not reflect our biological dependence upon insect pollinators. They don't align with how nature works, as Bateson says. But we know that policy and laws are mutually agreed upon coercions based on what we value. This is language from Garrett Hardin. And that we also, so these are things we have to agree on, of what we value and how we want to coerce one another into living within our biological limits. We also know that all environmental policy is about managing human behavior. And that in light of the conservation status of bees, the global declines, and the findings of the values of urban and suburban habitat, these very empirical biological facts with explicit ties to food security, economic security, and national security do matter. And we need to begin to ask, how tightly should we cling to our social constructions about aesthetic considerations that are hampering insect pollinator populations? The American lawn is a social construct. We made it up. We all agreed to it. Industries formed around it. They've constructed and reinforced these preferences. Yes, there are some genetic preferences in there related to survival that go back. But the beauty of any social construction, any social construct, is that they can be reconstructed. We know that people value bees. They value food. We value pollinator-dependent agriculture. The research is clear. Loss of flowers equals the loss of bees. The loss of bees equals the loss of quality of life and food security. We know that small city and suburban lawns can have an impact, as well as flower gardens in rural areas. And so it's these small policy changes that I think are worthy targets to pilot approaches to lead to larger changes. With that, I will end. Thank you very much.
Great. Thanks so much, Damon, for excuse me, my son's Damien, Damon, for breaking down that the policy world into pieces that those of us who are not strong in policy can understand. We've got a number of questions and also an observation. You were focusing on state policies and you broke those down into 5 themes. And I noticed that one of those themes didn't include license plates, which it seems is all that our Ohio policy is working toward. We have 2 pieces in your paper about license plates. Any suggestions for those of us in states that maybe don't have as many things happening positive policy-wise for pollinators?
Yes, license plates are a great funding mechanism. Some states really do it quite well, like Ohio. In Missouri, what we're into here are sales taxes, just fractions of cents on sales tax. So whatever your state does well that matches the state's identity around its policy and kind of how it functions, I would recommend trying to target those areas of action. I think what you learn in working in policy is once you understand the policymaking process, you can begin to identify points of access. And you have some legislators who are really state focused and most want to do what's right for the state. They're true public servants. And so finding those voices and those folks, I think, can be a route to begin having some conversations and kind of educating legislators about what's important to citizens and what other states are doing. We've got plenty of examples. You can cut and paste from the laws of other states. I think that's okay to find policies that work for your state.
Great, thanks. That's helpful. And so, speaking of cutting and pasting, is there a place where you have kind of linked those policies that you pulled together through that extensive research, or how to find those details? How does Montana search for those laws that you've enumerated there?
Yeah, and that's why we did the study with the state laws, because there was nothing like that. There is a state council of there's a council. They're nonprofit NGOs of state legislators that begin to assemble that policy. I put one of their logos up in a slide. So those are a few of the places that you can gather that name for you. Yeah, that's the National Caucus of Environmental Legislators would be another place to look for it. But no, I mean, that's why we wrote the papers, that this is scattered. And same thing with the state wildlife action plans. These policies are too scattered to be useful. People have to have access to them and have to find them if we're going to coordinate to get something done here.
Okay, great. Sorry, turn off my mute. So Eileen is interested in power line corridors, and I just wonder how policies might affect, used by utility companies in this sort of fashion.
Yeah, there is actually a lot of good work happening on that recently. And a collaborator of mine in Wisconsin, which is an environmental consulting firm, is working with USDA and U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service on finding kind of a formula for utility corridors and right-of-ways, particularly for power lines. And some companies are quite proactive about this. So that would be one area to investigate. In terms of law, I think nothing jumps out in terms of what's been set up. Because it depends on whether it's a regulated energy market or deregulated and how that utility system's set up. But it's a lot of leadership can come out of corporations on that front. And I think that's where you're going to get the most traction. So if you have connections to energy utility groups, that's one area that I think is going to grow. USDA U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service are just now starting to send money to that area.
Okay, great. Thanks. Folks, we are just about at the top of the hour. So if you have to hop out, I know that Damon would appreciate a thank you in the chat box. And we have a few more questions that we'll go through. So if you want to come back, we'll have that recording with those questions. So Angie asks if you would spend a few more minutes on those plants that did well in the fall for bee sources.
Yeah, let's see, what did I show here?
So the slide went by quickly, and she was just wondering what some of those.
Yeah, dandelions. This is what I shared. Other folks are better. Denise, probably you are better to answer this than I. But red clover, dandelions, ivy, even thistles, the goldenrod, solidago, even some of that daisy fleabane. Just pay attention to late fall, what's being foraged by bees. But those are a few. Some of those weedy species that may be edge species, let them grow. Of course, the other natives as well that do well with pollinators. Yeah.
Anthony wonders if there are examples from European countries or possibly our neighbors up north of good policy.
Yeah, the central agricultural policy of Europe is beginning to look at how the incentive structures for ecosystem services within their ag funding and ag subsidies can be used to support insect pollinator conservation. I find that the European municipalities have really been quite active in funding habitat spaces, and it seems like a lot of the work coming out of from our European colleagues show nationally organized policy efforts. There's one that just came out in the paper from Ireland. So those are a couple of examples, but I haven't looked too closely. I'm staying in English and to the U.S. right now.
Just reading through all that legislation in English is plenty, I'm sure.
Yeah, it was a lot.
A lot of copy needed to keep up with all that.
Yeah, indeed.
Chris wonders, and you mentioned a few of these ideas already, but Chris wonders if you have recommendations for those on the call who are working to draft or influence city policy related to bees and other pollinators.
Yes, we are trying to pull some of that together as well. We have a database of about 600 and something municipal policies. So we're trying to pull that together as a resource for people. It's not in any shareable shape yet. But what I would recommend is some real simple research in looking, maybe setting up a Google alert, right? There's a way that you can tell Google what to send you on a weekly or daily basis from what is published on the internet. And so I would begin looking up municipal or ordinance, and then combine that with the Boolean and pollinator, insect pollinator bees. That would be the place to begin to look. But for Minneapolis is doing a lot of good stuff. Minnesota's doing a lot of good stuff. There are certain cities that are leading the way. Austin, Texas has some as well. There's a lot that's happening. I really like the Oslo Bee Highway in Norway, which is a mapping project of identifying citizens' gardens that are pollinator friendly, as well as public spaces and city properties that are pollinator friendly or planted with native plants. And through that project, they're trying to develop a highway of habitat for bees to move across kind of the urban-rural gradients. A similar program in a community in Seattle of taking the next to the sidewalks, the margin lands, and turning those into bee highways. So some of those are other examples. You may look to some of the state legislatures' laws that were passed. That might be a place to look as well.
Okay, great. Alan says he understands that Texas regulators have banned beekeeping in state conservation lands and wonders if there are other examples of this kind of policy, and if you have an opinion on how effective that might be.
Yes, I was not aware of that. I think that makes sense, right? You add 40, you add a hive of 40,000 honeybees, and then what is everybody else going to eat that has been living there, right? All the native pollinators. So I think that makes sense. I know it's tough on beekeepers they're trying to make a living. That's very difficult. But on the other hand, I'm hoping that that is coupled with good monitoring and measuring of those populations. But I was not aware of that policy.
Okay, great. So Damon, thanks again for your time this morning. Folks, thanks for joining in. I love the, we talk a lot in environmental issues about operations to have an effect as well. And I think your work really shines a light on some of that important work happening